Hi, in this quick tip, we're going to ask a question that I'm sure many of you have asked yourselves. Why bother with scales and arpeggios? After all, it's much more fun, isn't it, to play pieces. That's what most of us really want to do when we're making music. And then you come to a music exam and often you find you've got to play scales and arpeggios, or you've got a music teacher insisting that you do these things. So is it some modern day form of torture, or is there some purpose behind having to go through all of this? Well, actually, there is. First of all, if you think about it, when you play pieces, you're generally speaking either moving to a note that's next door to the one you've just played, or you're leaping to another note. The only other option is that you could be repeating a note. But if you're going from one note to its neighbouring note, then you're doing something that is a scale movement. And if you're leaping from one note to another, well, you're essentially doing something that's an arpeggio movement. So even at that level, actually working on scales and arpeggios can actually help your fluency in the playing of pieces. And if you see working on scales and arpeggios as a means to helping you play pieces better, well, surely that's a good starting point that maybe begins to convince you that dealing with the scales and arpeggios is quite a good idea. There are other advantages as well. For example, if you learn the scale of C major, you kind of know what's going on in C major. If you learn the arpeggio of C major, you kind of work out something that you're going to meet very commonly in pieces in C major. So when you play a piece of music in C major, you just kind of know that you're dealing with the white notes, we haven't got any flats or sharps to worry about, and it gives you confidence. Well, maybe C major is an obvious example, but once you get into more extreme keys, once you're playing a piece of music in 5 flats, for example, that might be in D flat major, it can look a little bit scary at first, but if you know your scale of D flat major, then you know that you're dealing with all of the black notes and you've only got 2 white notes to worry about, namely F and C. So actually knowing the scale and the arpeggio for the key of the piece that you're going to play is going to make you much more reliable in finding the notes. So really working ultimately through every single key in terms of scales and arpeggios should ultimately mean that you can play a piece of music in any key. So there's another very direct link. There are other things that you can practice through scales and arpeggios. For example, when you move from one note to the next, is the legato that you're producing really well connected? If you're a keyboard player, for example, some people play their scales with the notes slightly detached. And they don't really ever play a really good legato. Some people have the opposite problem where you play the first note, you put the second note down and the first note's still sounding. So we have this kind of overlap of notes and then it all sounds a little bit kind of smudgy. So when you're playing scales on the keyboard, you can actually work very cleanly from one note to the next, exchanging one note for the next note, so that the move from one note to the next is absolutely smooth, but very clean. If you're playing a wind instrument or a brass instrument, for example, then the equivalent of this is really getting good coordination. In other words, do the finger movements you're doing tie in with the tongue movements? So we get tongue-finger coordination absolutely sorted. If you're a string player, well, of course, finger and bow coordination is the equivalent there that you're practicing. So dealing with those kind of technical things is something that we can refine dealing with our scales and our arpeggios. If you're going to do your scales and arpeggios detached, playing staccato scales, for example, on the keyboard, or doing tongued scales if you're blowing something, or separate bows if you're a string player, have you got an evenness of notes? So the notes are all the same length as you're going through, or do you end up slurring a pair of notes here and there, or is one note a bit short, a bit abrupt, and the next one's a little bit too long? So getting evenness into the detached playing into the staccato playing is another thing that you can practice. It's a very good means of getting around the geography of your instrument. As you're playing scales and arpeggios, actually can you get in and out of registers, particularly if you're a wind player or a brass player or a singer. If you're a string player, how does it go as we get into the higher positions? Sometimes when you hear string players playing their scales, they're quite nicely in tune in the bottom octave or the bottom 2 octaves, and actually it's the top octave that's not quite so good. So if you're a string player, you can really work on your intonation and get those higher positions sorted out. If you're a wind or a brass player, you can deal with getting the intonation really good at the extremes of the register, but also integrating register changes. So that's all an important thing. Through your scales and arpeggios, making sure that you're delivering an even rhythm and making sure that you're delivering even tone. So I hope you're beginning to see through this quick tip that actually there are many advantages to working on scales and arpeggios. And even when you've been playing for years, actually coming back to scales and arpeggios can just sharpen up your technique. So it's good for technique, it's good for key knowledge, it's good for geography of the instrument, it's good for dealing with register changes, intonation, evenness of rhythm, evenness of tone. All these things are big advantages when you come to play your pieces. So instead of seeing scales and arpeggios as some kind of torture, why not see them as something that's really enabling to the playing of pieces? And then maybe there's a fresh enjoyment to be gained, or at least you've got some idea that they're doing you some good when it comes to playing pieces. So there we are. Enjoy playing your scales and arpeggios.